The sights that you see, the sounds that you hear, the feelings and emotions that are elicited out of you. These are all avenues that games use to immerse you as a player and get you invested in the experience. Some might be subtle, like a low-volume wildlife ambience track in a deep jungle section that you might not even really be consciously aware of, while others are more visceral, like the incredibly well-animated moments of Joel smashing through a clicker's head with a lead pipe in The Last of Us. But most of the tools that developers use to hook you in and bring you into their world are somewhere in between those two extremes. Things you may or may not notice from time to time, but also do a great job at getting you as close as possible to feeling what the character in the game is feeling. Controller vibration is something that exemplifies this very well, whether it's something subtle like the little bumps you might get from sprinting or a jump, or a massive shock to the hands from being shot by an enemy or shooting one of those sentry guns that every first-person shooter seems to need to have. The various types and degrees of vibration in controllers have come a long way since their implementation over 20 years ago, and still shape our experiences with games by bringing us closer and closer to feeling the impacts of what is happening on the screen. While some gamers might find vibration feedback distracting and just turn it off, some even going so far as to remove the rumble motors from their controllers entirely, for most it still works well, and the incremental improvements in it have not gone unappreciated. Today, we'll take a look at some of those incremental improvements to get a better idea of just how far the technology has come and where it is likely to go in the future. Mechanized vibration is certainly a bigger part of our lives now than it has ever been. Cell phones in particular seem to find any excuse to implement the function and have mastered it to the point of actually making specific notes out of various vibration frequencies to mimic various songs. Nowadays, we are so familiar with this type of alert that there are even people who claim to suffer from phantom vibration syndrome, which is when they think their phone is vibrating when it is in fact not. That is not the way it always was, though. It wasn't that long ago when the brick cell phones of the early 2000s and early versions of haptic feedback in console gaming controllers were seen as a nifty futuristic novelty and not taken for granted nearly as much as they are now. That said, while it might seem like those devices were the pioneers of haptic feedback, they were far from it. It was actually many decades before this era when vibration feedback was used for aircrafts, excavators, and other large vehicles as an alternate means of alerting the pilot or driver of said vehicles to certain dangerous circumstances so they can avoid potential obstacles or malfunctions of the machinery from pushing it too far. Most of these vibrating mechanisms were pretty simple in concept and just used huge metal rods that would be raised and lowered at various speeds depending on the conditions at hand, creating the vibration effect that was hard to ignore. It would be many more years of this basic principle being used in other technology sectors like hospital and military equipment before it would make its way into video games, but even then, it was only used in the most advanced of arcade games, primarily racing games and pinball games, to give the user that sense of urgency that those experiences demanded to achieve a higher level of immersion. After many years of this style of feedback being experimented with and developed in the arcades, the home consoles would finally get their own versions of it. The Nintendo 64's Rumble Pack would be the first to really gain any steam, as it would fit well in Nintendo's long list of odd but fun, novel, innovative ideas. Star Fox 64 was the game that was marketed as the ideal way to experience the controller add-on. But in reality, it ended up being compatible with a large amount of the library, and most users enjoyed the feeling it brought to the games. That's not to say it was perfect, though. The Rumble Pack was an add-on and an optional feature to the standard controller. As such, it would take up the controller's single expansion slot that many games expected you to use for memory to save. That would put gamers in an awkward position, where they would have to choose between vibration and saving, which would lead to most just not using the vibration for those games because saving was becoming less and less negotiable at that time. The Rumble Pack was unable to draw enough power from the console to function, and would require 3 AA batteries to use, which would of course need to be replaced eventually. So, while Nintendo was the first to bring controller vibration to the home console scene, these flaws would be exploited very soon with Sony's DualShock, which improved on the Rumble Pack in just about every conceivable way. Instead of one motor in the back of the center of the controller, the DualShock had two, one in each handle, which brought much more precision and depth to the concept, and would open the floodgates for different degrees of vibration that would really feel different depending on what you were doing, and even letting Psycho Mantis take over your controller to demonstrate his power.
You still don't believe me? I will show you my psychokinetic power. Put your controller on the floor. Put it down as flat as you can. That's good. Now I will move your controller by the power of my will alone.
It was also nice to see the function in a controller by default, with no additional purchase or batteries needed. Sony's rebuttal to the Rumble Pack, plus the slew of Microsoft's gaming controllers that would follow suit for PC gamers, would make the Rumble Pack feel inferior pretty quickly. Microsoft and Sony would continue on with their own controller vibration technology in the next generation of consoles, only to eventually discover it wasn't really their technology. Immersion Corporation would eventually sue both companies for patent infringement and get the entire thing tied up in a legal gray area for some time, while Nintendo would carry on, narrowly escaping the legal troubles of their competitors with their own, just different enough version of Rumble in the GameCube, as well as something quite similar to the N64 Rumble Pack for the Game Boy, which would, you guessed it, require additional battery power and only work with specific games. A trend that Nintendo would continue with their handhelds all the way up to the DS, and finally fix it with the Switch. Eventually, the dust-up between Sony, Microsoft, and Immersion would settle just in time for Sony's redesign of their PS3 controller, the DualShock III, which, despite its flaws in other areas, would implement a much smoother version of the bulkier vibration motors in the DualShock 1 and 2, but still keeping the basic principle of a slightly off-balanced motor that would cause the shaking we all know and love. It was the 8th generation of consoles that would see a more fundamental shift in controller vibration, however. By this time, vibration in controllers was expected and worked with technology more similar to what's found in smartphones than the giant hulking motors of yesteryear. The controller that really pushed it the furthest was Microsoft's Xbox One pad that brought multiple new motors into the mix, one for each handle, as well as smaller, more precise motors for the triggers themselves that intensified the pulling of said triggers and brought unprecedented depth to what they could communicate to the player through action games and driving games most notably. The principles that were brought into that controller seem to be largely what is guiding the upcoming PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X pads. While Nintendo is enjoying a cozy relationship with Immersion for their HD Rumble Joy-Cons, Sony and Microsoft are continuing to make their controllers vibrate more and more like our smartphones do, with varying degrees of intensity and depth. As such, we may have hit somewhat of a plateau with vibration in controllers for a while. The variety of feelings that the haptic feedback that the next round of controllers seems to be capable of will likely satisfy gamers of all persuasions for many years to come, and Nintendo seems to be doing fine with its Joy-Cons for the most part. VR might be the next frontier for vibration to really integrate with, but that is a topic we'll have to save for another day. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.